Welcome back, everyone, to Core Conversations. I'm Charlie Thomas, the Executive Director of ACTC, the Association for Core Texts and Courses. And Core Conversations is our online conversation series. I am so pleased you've found us today, whether you're finding us before our live Zoom, which is coming up soon, or finding this as a recording on our YouTube channel. Either way, we're glad you found us. We've developed quite a library of core conversations on all kinds of topics, from Plato to Simone de Beauvoir to Frederick Douglass to all kinds of things. And it really has been a pleasure to do this work. But every core conversation has two parts. And so what you're watching is the first part of a two-part series. And in this part, in a moment, it will be my distinct pleasure to hand things over to my colleague at Mercer, Kevin Honeycutt. And he'll give some remarks on Niccolo Machiavelli, which I'm pretty excited to hear. And for this recording, his remarks will be mainly what we do. I might take the liberty of asking one question at the end or so, depending on our timing. But really, this recording is all about his remarks on Machiavelli. But then on October 21st, 2022, we will convene again on Zoom, but this time for an open conversation. And that is October 21st at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. If you found this video, then you probably know how to find the link to join us on Zoom, but it is on the ACTC webpage, coretext.org. At the top, you'll find a drop-down menu called Core Conversations. If you hover over it, the first link is to our Zoom link. You click on that and you will go right to the Zoom room and join us to talk about Machiavelli. As much as I love these sessions, these recorded sessions where I get to hear people's thoughts on these great thinkers, I really love the Zoom conversations. We always have a good crowd and really interesting conversation. And so everyone is welcome. Invite your students, invite your colleagues, invite your friends. Everyone is welcome to Core Conversation. So without any further preliminaries, it really is my pleasure to hand things over to Kevin Honeycutt. I'm going to let him introduce himself to you and then go ahead and roll right into his remarks on Machiavelli. But thank you so much for doing this, Kevin.
Of course. My pleasure. So I'm Kevin Honeycutt. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy at Mercer. I'm the Director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and I teach in our Great Books program at Mercer also. I have been teaching the Prince, I would say, almost continuously for the past 12 years, basically every semester, including some summers, sometimes more than once a semester. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Prince in particular, but I'd be happy at the session on the 21st to answer questions about Machiavelli in general. So first, just a little bit about my background and why I arrange the intro to philosophy class that I use it in as I do, and then how that book fits in, and then I just want to talk about how I teach the book and some of the ideas I've come to the book about. So I've been teaching for 15 years. I have a background in coaching also. I've been an assistant coach at the collegiate level at a soccer program. So the way I try to arrange the classroom space is a lot of times the way that we would think about arranging things on a field and how to convey certain ideas. So the way when I usually teach the Prince, it's in an intro to philosophy class. We teach it in Great Books also, but there, the pedagogy would be a seminar format. When I use it in intro to philosophy, I use it as one of 3 or 4 books to put different views of philosophy on the table and different literary genres on the table. So for instance, I've used Plato's Alcibiades before, Machiavelli's Prince, Descartes' Discourse on Method, and Sartre's Nausea. I've also, instead of Sartre, used Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. I've used Hannah Arendt as a 20th century piece. These days, what I have been experimenting with is using Xenophon and Plato and Machiavelli and tracing certain themes through them. So the big questions that I teach the Prince in a philosophy class, so as opposed to a political theory or a history class. So the questions that we tend to focus on are what is philosophy, what's a human being, and what is God. So research-wise, I'm interested in questions of contingency and mortality and memory, but at the 100 level, and when I'm introducing students to ideas, those are the questions we start with. What's philosophy, what's a human being, and what's God? And I usually add a fourth question. Right now, it's what is honor, that we run through all these books. So one of the things I work on with these books is, everyone at ACTC knows is these books have, in the parlance of our times, transformational value, right? That just reading these books in and of themselves is a valuable experience. But what I try to focus on also is what, again, in the parlance of our times is this transactional value. In other words, these books, you can read these books and pick up certain skills, close reading techniques and things like that. So one of the priorities I put on, one of the things I push that I prioritize in my intro to philosophy course is reading very closely, pattern recognition, those types of skills. So it's accidental in a way that we use these books, but I find that the books I have mentioned, and the Prince in particular, are very good for that pedagogical end, right? Working backward from that pedagogical aim. So when I use the Prince, it's the third or fourth often in a series of books that I'm presenting, sometimes the second, but the point is it's never the first. And in the first text, I don't use a lot of historical background. And when I set up the Prince, I give a smattering of historical background. So I'll tell students, for instance, prior to 1494, the Medici are in charge. And then for 4 years, Savonarola is in charge, who shows up in chapter 6. So it's interesting to foreground that, right? And then from 1498 to 1512, Florence is ostensibly a republic, and Machiavelli is working for them. So when they read about republics and the Florentines in the book, we've already mentioned that, right? And then after 1512, the Medici come back, and Machiavelli is fired and tortured, and then he writes The Prince in the immediate aftermath of that. Now, what that means, I leave open for the student's interpretation, but that's at least the context in which the book is written. And then those questions of audience and the questions of intention sort of naturally emerge when they know a little bit about the context itself. So as I've said before, one of the things I work on is close reading and pattern recognition and mucking around, I think, in the weeds of the text. Several years ago, in fact, I gave a paper for this at an ACT conference. I was trying to think of the Prince in terms of its background, its artistic background, for instance, the artistic background of Florence and Venice, and seeing the Prince in light of that. I think over the past few years, I've moved away from that. We do talk about context, but it's really the text that we focus on the most. And I've quit trying to understand the Prince in light of what Machiavelli was trying to do necessarily, or the context, to explain away the text in that way, and to just focus on the language that he uses. So I provide the students a little bit of context, but I make it clear that this goes with it, right? It goes with the text, context. So when we get to the text, I focus on the big course questions. What is philosophy? What's a human being? And what is God? Now, the word philosophy is never mentioned in the Prince, so that makes students work hard from the very beginning. And I tell them only one person is named a philosopher. So who is it? Find it, right? Human beings are talked about a lot, and God shows up in very interesting ways. And they've already been conditioned to see these questions in the other books that we've been reading. So why the Prince? I guess I should say a quick word about that before I turn to the book itself. So one of the reasons I like to use the Prince, like right now, for instance, I'm using it with Xenophon and Plato. So you can use Xenophon and Plato to see subtle differences between people who otherwise appear very similar, and sometimes the differences may be more important than the similarities. Machiavelli at first glance looks very different, I think, from someone like Xenophon or Plato, but he's a great admirer of Xenophon, and I'm not convinced he's not a great admirer of Plato, although that's, I think, a heterodox opinion, right? But one of the reasons at an intro level to use him as a contrast, or at least a purported contrast, is to expose students to difference, right? Different views of what the best life is, different views of what we should be doing with ourselves, how to combat contingency or mortality, that there's a a kind of a positing of a contrast that may be different in kind from what Xenophon and Plato have said before, right? Or what someone like Descartes or Sartre or Hannah Arendt will say later, right? Just this posing of different possibilities, that it's not clear what philosophy even is, and there's certainly different answers to that question at any rate, right? So whatever. So we start with the Prince. The other interesting thing about the Prince is that there's a lot of curiosities that confront you immediately with it. For instance, it has two titles. You know, it has a Latin title and an Italian title. It's not clear which one's supposed to be the real title. So the fact that it has two titles and it's not clear which one it's supposed to have is curious, right? Machiavelli in chapter 1 lays out what looks like the outline of the whole book. But that outline is exhausted by chapter 7. And as early as chapter 8, you start getting into things that he hasn't said that he's going to talk about. So again, I say to students, you know, if your essays were like this, I would be surprised. And I would say, why didn't you do what you said you were going to do, right? This is not a rushed work. I mean, what's he up to? In other words, this isn't just something he trots out in a couple of weeks and then never goes back to again. So why is he doing that? Why is he introducing new ideas that early in the book, you know, there's 26 chapters plus a dedicatory letter. By chapter 8, already our expectations have been frustrated about what the book is supposed to be about. So it has two titles. It's not clear from the first chapter what it's about. And there are other frustrations. You know, for instance, in the dedicatory letter, he seems to divide the world up into two groups, peoples and princes, you know, and he'll often do this. He'll say there's republics and principalities, or there's virtue and fortune, or there's men and women, or whatnot, right? But these what we would call now binaries, or these distinctions, they always dissolve, right? It's far from clear to me, for instance, that virtue and fortune are necessarily opposed. It's not clear at all to me what men and women are for him. In fact, some people think he's deflating these differences altogether. It's not clear to me. And in fact, he shows explicitly, in fact, that the world being divided up into the people and princes is a provisional or perhaps intentionally misleading picture, that there are other people in the world. For instance, in chapter 9, he calls them the great. And in chapter 19, he talks about soldiers. And he explicitly uses similar terms to talk about these things, right? So, in other words, he's there are discontinuities in the book and frustrated expectations. And by this point, even if it's the second book we've read, students are expecting riddles, I think, in philosophical works. But I have found a lot of students of all stripes, accountants, engineers, chemists, I mean, they're just puzzled by the mysteries. They hadn't really, many of them have not looked at books this way. And I encourage them to look at books as if they were accountant. There's missing entries in the log. You know what I'm saying? There's missing data in the lab notebook. What is going on in this book? It's just data, right? What Machiavelli is saying. And so it's about how do we process the data? How do we look for the signal in the noise? How do we think about missing data points? I used to be a chemist, right? And so I think one of the ways I look at books is still, there's a legacy of that scientific training, I think, for me. So then these natural curiosities, I think these structural or let's say substantive curiosities about the book just start to naturally emerge. And by naturally here, I just mean like spontaneously for the students. You know, why is it that he says his most valuable, his most esteemed possession is the knowledge of the actions of great men? And then he doesn't use the word knowledge again until chapter 14. So like half the book, his so-called esteemed possession, it just never shows up again, right? Why is it that when he is talking about what he calls cities or republics, when he gives examples of conquering princes, they're all republics, right? I mean, why is it that he says there are these 5 rules in chapter 3 that you're not supposed to break, but then he gives an example of someone who breaks all of them and breaks another rule and would have succeeded if he hadn't done something else? You know, it's just, in other words, typically, I think it's not uncommon for people to read the text or the Prince as this dry technical manual of, I don't know, how to be an autocrat or how to be cruel or something like that, right? Or they read it, and there are some people doing important work in this regard these days as it's thoroughly subversive, so that it's all satirical. And this is not a new view, but it's been given new heft by some people recently. It's not a it's he's presenting a shocking teaching in order to subvert it. Now, I'm not sure about either one of those. I'm not sure quite what he's doing, and I guess what I do with students is just to ask what is going on, right? Like, this book looks like it's very clear, and that's always a sign, I think, in philosophy that something is wrong, when there's a very clear consensus about what a book means or what the author's intention is, and then it's almost immediately not clear at all, right? So what I try to talk to about students is, this is real thought, this is real intellectual work, right? Is that when life is ambiguous or life is not clear, then you really have to muck around in the data. And so, they just start to notice things, right? So these skills, I talked about the transactional value of these books earlier. When you really start to subject them to, I don't have a particular, I think, style that I read. I just call it close reading, but apparently that's a thing. And I don't mean my thing to be a thing. But people have told me it sounds like new criticism, or it sounds like deconstruction, or I don't know. I just say, let's just look at things closely and see what emerges if we pay attention. For instance, if you pay attention to chapter 6, these great examples are talked about. Now, he said the knowledge of the actions of great men. He doesn't use the word knowledge in chapter 6, unless I'm mistaken, but he's already said that's his most esteemed possession. So we might look to those people: Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus. And he mentions them 3 times, but he doesn't list them in the same order. Now, that may mean nothing, right? But as I tell students, I was like, Sherlock Holmes has to notice the dog hair on the leg before he can ask, like, what does it mean that there's 3 types of dog hair on this person's leg, right? So in other words, unless you're paying attention and reading the book closely, you don't notice that he doesn't list the names the same way each time, right? Now, that may mean nothing, and I'm not saying that it does mean something, but students, you can see the gears turning. They say, like, why would you do that? We wouldn't do that writing papers. We're taught about parallelism or whatever, right? Why would a purportedly great author do this in a great book, right? Why, when these figures show back up again in 26, is one of them missing? Importantly, right? And how does that make us go back and look at chapter 6 again, right? Why, when we see knowledge finally come back up in chapter 14, it's in a very unexpected context. It seems to be about war, but then the chapter has really almost nothing to do with war. It's all about intellectual activity. And there are these images that point to other chapters in the book about rivers and about flooding and things like that, right? So anyway, it's just when you start kind of following these threads, and when, as I do, focus on certain questions that are not just, what does Machiavelli mean by this historical example, which is not an idle question, right? Like we focus on some of them, Cesare Borgia, for instance, right? But there are many historical examples, and we don't focus on most of them. And I don't focus too much on the politics, like, what does he mean by a republic or a principality? We don't focus on that too much. And I think for many people, they would just say that's a very strange way of reading the book. But it seems to me it's not clear what those words mean, and that his real concerns might be something else. For instance, I'm not really concerned. I'm not really sure chapter 14 is about war, for instance, even though it ostensibly is. It's not war in the conventional sense anyway, right? So when you start noticing things like that, and when you start following questions through, when you start looking for certain things. So in a philosophy class, we're interested in philosophy, the love of wisdom, etymologically. And so when you look at where all Machiavelli is mentioning wisdom, certain patterns start to emerge. When he talks about a wise prince, or people who are wise men say this, or people who are purported to be wise in our day, this and that, this language he uses, you just skim over those things normally if you're focused on other questions. But when you read with those questions in mind, all of a sudden the wisdom stuff just starts popping up everywhere, right? All of a sudden it seems like philosophy is everywhere in the Prince if you start looking for it. Someone's called a philosopher, like I had mentioned before, but it's not what you might call one of the usual suspects. I'll just say, right? So it's a Stoic emperor. It's not any Platonist or Aristotelian or anything like that. It's Marcus Aurelius. So it's peculiar, but it's the type of thing you might not notice if you weren't looking for the certain things. So one of the things I try to suggest to students is that it really matters what kind of questions you read, and that the book looks really different if you read this in a political science class with other questions in mind. Even with me, we would be asking other questions, And so it just hopefully, and they often do, get a sense of just the richness of these books, that it really depends on what questions you're bringing to them, and that there's so much there. It seems like it's inexhaustible, just this one book. And a lot of books are like that, right? And for some people, that's paralyzing. But I find that it is exciting. And usually students pick up on that too. And often, I think perhaps because I use that transactional language and I talk about the fact that I used to be a chemist and all this stuff, often it is people you would not expect that find great value in these books, right? So accountants, engineers, scientists, people who, when they learn that literature can be dealt with seriously and systematically, rigorously, and it isn't just a bunch of opinions. That poetry, as T.S. Eliot says, can be as precise as mathematics, right? That when they pick up on those type things, that then it opens up a door for them. And Machiavelli, I find, is a very interesting door to open up, partly because the text is so curious, but also partly because Machiavelli is supposed to be hard-nosed, and you can introduce them to the text by saying there's a lot of practical advice in here, and there is, but the practical advice, ends up being about some pretty large-scale things, not just like don't take your people's money, but that your life's at stake, And so, as the Blessed Lady Flannery says, the life you save, it may be your own. And I tell students, you have to read like your life depends upon it, because it does. And because for people like Machiavelli, that's how they read. And if you want to wrestle with those people, then we have to really make an effort. So anyway, I think that's enough. I'm happy for you to ask me questions, and I'm happy to ask any questions at the session on the 21st. But hopefully that gives people a taste of how and why I use the book, and why I think it's a valuable tool pedagogically and also philosophically.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's great. I have to say that because Kevin and I both teach at Mercer, I often have the pleasure of having students in my classes who have been in Kevin's class before, and the minute they tell me that they've taken Kevin's intro class, I know that they can read, and that they've shown up with a sort of expectation that they're going to take these books seriously. So it's fascinating to have you talk about this a little bit, and thank you, thank you for teaching our students how to read so carefully. So our main conversation will be on the 21st, and everyone's invited, but I do get to take the privilege of asking one, just to sort of get us started, if you don't mind, taking
sure.
a question.
Sure.
So I guess I guess it's sort of a content question, and if this is too much, then we can save it for next time. But I'm going to go ahead and ask it. You said that yeah, one thing you mentioned kind of in passing was that you weren't sure that fortune and virtue were really opposed in the way that that the binary presentation of them seems to suggest. And it seems to me that this might be a nice nice kind of demonstration of the sort of reading that you're talking about, and also the kind of deep implications that sort of stepping back from the typical ways of approaching Machiavelli might have, not just for undergraduates, although certainly it does for them, but for us too. Because when I think about Virtù and Fortuna, they seem pretty opposed to me. So what can you say just a little bit? And we don't have a lot of time, and so you really can kick the can on this if you want. But could you say a little bit about what makes you think that maybe they're not opposed in the conventional sense, and how you kind of came to that sensibility, even if you don't have a clear sense of how it all plays out?
Sure. Well, they're not necessarily opposed. So, I should have said earlier, I guess. So I do a lot of work on Plato and Machiavelli and Bertrand de Jouvenel. And Jouvenel was a Rousseau scholar, and he says he comes to Rousseau as a familiar reader, right? And that's kind of how I like to think about myself as Machiavelli. I don't know if I would be considered a Machiavelli scholar. I don't know. It's not important to me, I guess. It's I do think I know the book pretty well, and I do think well. So I'll just give a couple of examples, right? So one is a couple of years ago, I taught the book one of the Discourses on Livy. Um, and I thought it was exceedingly strange. In other words, if you don't know what virtue is supposed to be from Machiavelli, you get very little sense of it in that book. There's three books to the Discourses. You get very little sense of it in the whole book, what virtue means. And I just thought that was very peculiar. In other words, if you kind of, as much as you can, come to the text without prejudice or prejudgment about what he's supposed to be saying, it's very strange, right? It's not clear to me what virtue is at all on the basis of book one, the Discourses on Livy. And that's just not normal. That's not like the kind of scholarly, well, I don't really know, but I have a very strong opinion about it. It was just very strange. I expressed it to the students. I said, it's very peculiar. So the Prince, I think, is the same way. I mean, virtu, it's a Latin word and it comes from it's an Italian word that comes from this Latin word that has to do with male, being man, right? So everybody points out correctly that virtue for Machiavelli has something to do with being male, right? And that fortuna it's fortune, but it can mean storms at sea and stuff. But fortune is explicitly called female in 25. So you got a nice binary there, men and women, right? And then you get this distinction between fortune and virtue in chapter one, and then it looks like in 25 that these things are opposed, and he'll say things like, where virtue hasn't been put into place to kind of direct or oppose fortune, then it'll just run rampant. It's like a river, one of these raging rivers that tears up trees and floods plains, whatever, right? So it looks like there, fortune's going to have its way unless virtue is put into place specifically to stop it. So it sounds oppositional, right? But I'll just say two things very quickly about and just in the interest of time, I guess. In that same chapter, I'll just reference two things. So one is that fortune is also called a woman at the end of that chapter. And Machiavelli expresses this hypothetical that people often read as this like misogynistic imperative. And maybe it is, that if you want to hold fortune down, it's necessary to beat and strike her down. But the problem is it's a hypothetical, right? And I discussed this with students and said, look, it's a conditional statement, and it's expressing what would need to be the case if you had certain desires. So if you want to hold fortune down, it's necessary to beat her and strike her down. But, I said, it's like saying if you want to hold the Incredible Hulk down, it would be necessary to beat and strike him down. Implicit in that statement is a kind of expression of the folly of it, perhaps the impossibility of it in principle, right? So it's far from clear to me that the stuff at the end of 25, for instance, is a suggestion about how to do it. And it might be a recommendation of what not to do, right? In other words, if you have disordered desires, it would be necessary to do these outrageous things. The lesson then is not to do the outrageous things, but to kind of change yourself somehow, right? You can't change the nature of fortune, right? But you might be able to change yourself. So I think that's part of what's going on there. The other thing that's going on that's weird in 25 in particular, where fortune really gets a significant treatment, is that the language used to describe fortune and to describe successful princes is the same language. So this word impeto, it gets translated as impetus or something a lot of times. It comes up over and over and over. So the same language used to describe multiple times fortune itself is used to describe successful princes, right? Which could mean any number of things, that princes are supposed to imitate fortune somehow, or that princes are supposed to supplant fortune somehow, or that virtue and fortune are not so different as they first appear. So that's the type of stuff that I like to do in my own work and that I like to do in class, is I say, look, fortune and virtue are supposed to be different, but there's a tremendous linguistic proximity, right? The image in which we talk about subduing fortune is very problematic and perhaps in principle impossible. And there are images of female princes. I think this is some other militating. There are at least two female princes in The Prince, Caterina Sforza and Dido, founder of Carthage, right? So women can be princes, right? In other words, women can take on manly characteristics. And maybe the problem with certain men is that they can't take on feminine characteristics. In other words, fortune is impetuous, right? And we're told in 25, it's better to be impetuous than cautious, And so it's just, maybe the problem is certain men don't imitate fortune enough right? They're imitating other men. So that I think suggests the difference. It's not at least like a kind of pressure and volume type thing, right? The other thing that's weird is Machiavelli's knowledge is the knowledge of the actions of great men, right? Fortune's a woman. And so I think the implication there is that he doesn't have knowledge of fortune. And so you have to be much more wary of how you kind of deal with it. And so maybe he feels like he really understands virtue. He doesn't understand fortune. And even people like Moses and Theseus need fortune to some extent in chapter 6, right? So it could be, I talk to students about this, engineers and students. It could be like pressure and volume, like the more pressure, the lower the volume. Maybe it's something like that, right? Virtue and fortune. It does not seem to me like it's like this, right? And so I don't know, right? I guess those are just a couple of examples. And I'm not saying the conventional read is wrong. It just certainly seems to be not nearly as straightforward as people make it out to be. Anyway, hopefully that's
Great.
a gesture of a response.
Yeah. No, that's great. And it gives us lots to talk about on October 21st. So let's bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Kevin, for doing this for us. I really look forward to the conversation we'll have in a couple of weeks. And thanks everyone out there.
Professors never like to talk about ideas.
No, of course not. And thanks everyone out there for joining us today. And please do join us on October 21st, 2022, live. The link is available under Core Conversations on the coretext.org website. Everyone is welcome. We'd love to see you there, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, October 21st. We have a lot of other things going on. Registration is open for our conference in Tilburg, Netherlands in January. The topic there is resilience, and there's a really nice theme statement also available online. Please join us January 19th and 20th. Papers and proposals are currently being accepted for that conference. Everyone is invited. The Europeans come over to the North American conference all the time. They would love for us to come over and participate in their conference. So I'm trying to help make that happen. We also have coming up our first webinar with the American Academy for Liberal Education. Sorry, I got that. The American Academy for Liberal Education, where they're going to do a webinar for us on what we as liberal arts faculty really need to know about accreditation. It's designed just for us by people who understand us and want to help us understand this massive and important and complicated system that we operate within. So ACTC has a lot going on. Please join us when you can, and but especially October 21st, 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Zoom to talk to Kevin Honeycutt. Thanks again, Kevin. Bye, everybody.